what we're going to do right now is jump into ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So, in fact, we're proudly, we're delighted to have, in fact, experts at Hogan Lovells on the topic to share their perspectives, their ideas on the topic. And it's going to be naturally, as it always is, a healthy, productive discussion here on stage as well. And not just sharing perspectives, but also understanding, helping us all make sense and understand the importance of ESG in the context of sustainability, sustainable urban mobility, and how companies can really prioritize ESG in their business strategies. I'm intrigued as much as you are really to hear how this is going to unfold right before us right now. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the panelists and the moderator as well. So first of all, from Husk Stone, co-founder of Super 73, Alix Armour, please come and join us. Also, global leader of mobility and transportation from Hogan Lovells, Patrick Ayad, global director of thought leadership, mobility and transportation from Hogan Lovells. Our moderator, in fact, please come and join us as well. And together with us all here on stage, VP of General Counsel from the Middle East and Africa at Stellantis, Siobhan Dalton.
All right, thank you for joining us today for this panel about ESG. As mentioned, I'm Lance Bultena. I'm with Hogan Lovells, which is a global law firm, 2,500 plus lawyers, 40 some offices. My job is to be the director of thought leadership. So I think about how government policy interacts with technology change and how that evolves business models. So ESG is a really broad topic. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to just frame it up a little bit, how we're going to narrow that down. We can't talk about everything today. And then we're going to focus on sustainability and the circular economy. And I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves a bit more in just a second. So ESG, is, we need to just be reminded, originated in 2004 with Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, who wanted to start a conversation. And boy, did he eventually light a raging fire. Every business is thinking about ESG. It's a top-level board issue. But there's some issues: environmental, social, governance, big, broad topics. How does one define ESG? We might all have a different answer. Even within a category like sustainability, what are our priorities? We might each prioritize different things. And that means there are trade-offs. That's getting more complex as intersections occur with things like geopolitics. It's just supply chains in a bigger way than any time since the Cold War. So as I said earlier, we're going to focus on sustainability and the circular economy. And I think you'll see why once you hear some of the introductions. So Siobhan, could you introduce yourself a bit?
Okay, hello, I'm Siobhan Dalton. I'm screeching. I'm American. I went to school in the US, but I've been in France for 20 years. I've worked for a couple of law firms that are less prestigious than Hogan Lovells, so I'm very happy to be here with them. I've worked for an energy company also. I've worked in Peugeot. I've worked in Free to Move, which is the Peugeot's mobility branch. And now I'm working in the circular economy area and in Africa, Middle East, but moving more into the circular economy because I think it's the next big legal specialty. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Siobhan. Alix.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alix Armour. I'm a French-American entrepreneur, now based in Amsterdam. I've been active in the urban mobility space for about 12 years now, most of which was building Super 73 as co-founder. And then my last role there was head of sustainability. Now I'm independently a consultant working with urban mobility startups, sustainability startups, and also recently in the renewable energy space.
Patrick.
Yeah, it's interesting. My father is from Egypt, so that combines us, and I'm actually French, although I was born and raised in Munich in Germany. So I'm the global leader of mobility transportation at Hogan Lovells, and I advise particularly on the regulatory framework for automotive companies, new mobility companies.
All right, thank you. So let's start with Siobhan. Siobhan, what's the circular economy, and is it more than just recycling?
Yes. In fact, recycling is, I would say, the last resort. To keep it very brief and very focused, the circular economy in a car company, it can be described as the 4 R's. So the first, in priority of preference, really. So the first R is repair. We have to, by regulation, and want to have more cars repaired and have less waste and less excess parts to deal with. That is done by garages, but now more with electric vehicles, that has to be something that we organize because it has to be specially trained to do it. The second is reuse. And reusing a part is taking a car from a repair shop or a car that we no longer need for research and development and breaking it down and then checking the parts to make sure they're still safe, but basically reselling them or reusing them ourselves. The third R is remanufacturing. A reused part on the market, about more or less 75% the value of a new part. The next one is remanufacturing. You take the part, you check that it's not, it doesn't even have to be safe because you're going to totally remanufacture it. You either do that yourself or you outsource it. The finished product you can sell for about 75% of the value of a new piece. And the last resort is recycling. Recycling for car companies was always a cost. It's the only one of these things that is a pure cost. It's required, and it's better than putting things into the recycle bin, but it's not that ideal. Now I'm seeing that you as a car company, you want to get your hands on the metals and maybe the plastics that are in things that are recycled. You're not going to get something recycled, lose the metals, and then go buy them back at a really fluctuating and high price. So it's becoming something that's interesting and not just required by the law. So I would keep in mind that recycling isn't what it's all about.
Thank you, Siobhan. Okay, now for a moment of audience participation. How many of you, when you heard the word circular economy, thought, really, it's about recycling? Oh, come on. I think it's more than that. Most people, I'm one of them, thought it was recycling. So thank you, Siobhan, for the enlightenment. One more follow-up, Siobhan. What does it take to make the circular economy work at scale for massive companies, for a global economy?
Right. This will sound Machiavellian, and we're going to see how my experience is really different. I'm in this massive international company, industrial and huge, slow moving. It has to be profitable to make it work the way I think it should work. You have to comply with the increasing number of regulations. So that doesn't have to be profitable, you just have to do it. But to get creative and to go beyond what the regulation requires and to not have companies, digging in their heels and doing the bare minimum, it's got to make economic sense. And even the World Economic Forum says that they wonder if ESG should be called economic and then SG, because it can be a profit center, but it also has to at least break even. And what makes it work is that it gets factored into the business model, not just in the responsibility of an ESG team, which I think was maybe the case before. These things were considered a separate topic. And then you have to be able to finance it. The CapEx is enormous. If you're going to do all of these 4 R's yourself, you need a lot of resources. So you have to be able to find the right partners. You have to be able to work with your suppliers. So a lot of things to make it work, actually.
Well, thank you. Alix, you started a well-known startup. You're now a consultant. How do you enter this circular economy?
Yes, I mean, as you can imagine, it's quite complex. There's many different ways to come across it. I think for companies who are just building up their business models, it's easier. There's a really great opportunity to start your processes integrating ESG from the very beginning, because for large corporations or above 200, 300 people, it gets really complicated to integrate any sort of ESG reporting or adding new metrics to traditional business models. So more and more I'm seeing it as less of a technical problem. It's also like mindset change. Really, is your whole team educated in some of these topics? Because for a lot of people, it is just about recycling. So I think that's where the challenge lies for startups. Either you're already creating a solution and innovating in a smart solution, that's having a positive impact, or you're kind of stuck with a legacy product, and on that subject you have to think about the end of life, the reverse logistics, all these regulations that are appearing monthly, daily, for electronic waste. Even the apparel industry doesn't know what's coming at it right now. So it's really important, think about your structure. What opportunities do you have now? Just seeing all these different types of business models, I see lots of opportunity, but it is challenging. So I would really recommend to understand what ESG means for you and how you can start implementing some of these processes as soon as possible, because it's just going to get more complicated.
But for you, the product itself, or for you, I mean, the startups at this conference, the product itself, its raison d'être is to be sustainable, all right? And that was never the priority for an automobile. That's not why we initially put them online. And I think most people are here because they want to make a difference. And we're starting to think about that.
Well, I guess that could be one of the advantages and disadvantages of the different models. If you're a startup, it might be you have fewer resources, but you have the ability to focus and really take something to the market, build it from the ground up. I guess, Siobhan, you're at a big entity. In theory, you've got a lot of people and a lot of resources, but also a really big ship to turn and to add something on. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, and we have buying power, and we can attract big partners, and we have economies of scale. So it's not all difficult. We have things that you guys just don't have. Everyone in the world, everyone in this whole industry wants to work with an international car maker. So there are some real benefits to it, but it's very different.
Yeah, it's really important for, you have different levels of influence. So if you have your investors on board with, your sustainability plan, that's great. If the executive team is on board, it really starts from that position. Sometimes you have a lot of, employees who are really pushing for it, which is great. So, but the biggest challenge that I've seen is it's coming from the top. So leadership, investors, if they're not involved in this process, then it's a lot harder for that to trickle down to the rest of the company.
Well, thank you. I think something that I heard from both Siobhan and Alix is regulations. And as ESG is advancing, we're moving from sort of aspiration and marketing to sort of rules. So Patrick, I understand there's some developing rules in the EU. Could you tell us what's happening and why it matters?
Yeah, and maybe just quickly on that point about, which really fascinates me about the established players in the mobility world and the car companies, of course. I mean, let's not forget that there have been environmental regulations for their products for years. I mean, the end-of-life vehicles directive is more than 20 years old. So that has always been around, and then we had, also rules for electric equipment and whatsoever. That started like 20 years ago. What I find interesting is that a lot of these companies here, the startups, they found their company just because of sustainability considerations. So it's a totally different mindset. And you just said it. It seems like an advertisement or whatever, but they're really doing it because it comes from their heart, basically. And so the legislator, of course, is now jumping on all of this and is trying to, introduce even more rules, and particularly also rules on circular economy. And we'll probably talk later also more specifically about batteries regulations. But let's not forget the environmental regulations are here for quite some time. and there will become stricter. And the more innovative solutions are presented, particularly by the startups, the regulator will look at that and will say, well, that's a good idea, we should regulate that. And then the traditional companies will have to implement. And also, let's not forget the S in ESG. That is indeed a new regulatory area, also relatively new, with the supply chain legislation that we can now see, particularly in Germany, but there's also a draft from the EU side regulating supply chain rules. Transparency, forced labor is an issue, and I think, Lance, in the US, there is a very recent, triggered by the Sheffield report, a recent investigation into car companies when it comes to forced labor. And that will be regulated, or is being regulated at the moment. And so we see a lot of more, as we say, hard law coming, being introduced versus the soft law that we've probably seen the years before when we were talking about sustainability or whatsoever.
Thank you. I mean, if you do surveys of boards around the world, ESG is always one of the top 3 or 4 concerns for every board and for every executive team. And as they go to their consultant team, they're on a global basis talking about how this is no longer a marketing issue, it's now compelled. And that's going to come across in a lot of ways, and also introduce new things like litigation and more activism. And the forced labor study is just one example of that, leading to congressional investigations in the United States. But Patrick, you mentioned batteries. As I look out from this stage, I see EVs, micro-mobility with batteries. Batteries are everywhere in the mobility sector. So let's take batteries and the circular economy. Siobhan, you're at Stellantis, a major global player with an EV initiative, combination of regulations and a business choice. How do you see batteries and the circular economy?
Batteries are more tricky than using the 4 Rs on other parts. There's not much danger in a car door. If you don't handle batteries right or correctly, you can negate almost the good things that the BEV is doing in terms of carbon emissions by producing it incorrectly and having it pollute afterwards. I would say it's more regulated, and the environmental, it's not just an environmental good you can do, you have to prevent the environmental harm that you're going to do. Batteries are also much more towards that last R. It's a recycling issue. So, because you can't, well, you can reuse them and remanufacture them, but I think that the focus at the moment is on the recycling. And then the metals are more precious, and the metals are things that you'd like to be able to get without having to go to countries where you think there's child labor and other things being done to get those metals. And there was something else I was going to say about about the battery issue, but I'll chime in when I can remember it. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Siobhan. I think it's worth mentioning that as you try to scale batteries at such a huge rate, acquisition of the minerals and the metals is very hard, and building that manufacturing capacity, so that circular economy is important. And Patrick mentioned the S in ESG. That S factor, social factor, is really huge for batteries, because a lot of those minerals, cobalt, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, are huge. There's some geopolitical issues involved, so it's more than just the environment and sustainability. There's a lot of other factors that come into play on batteries.
I did remember the other thing, which is that one thing that's interesting is you don't need to recycle your batteries if you extend their useful life. And you can't always extend their useful life in a car, but creating what we call second life batteries, or a second life for batteries, is also a huge thing. So looking for partners everywhere who are going to take the batteries off your hands and give them a second life, even if you can't. So that's a way to reduce, I wouldn't call that remanufacturing or reuse, but it's a big part of this business as well.
May I comment on that?
I was hoping you would.
Please.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of really cool activity in that space in the e-mobility world with the bikes, the bike industry. I mean, if you think about it, when Super 73 we appeared in 2016 and 2018 in Europe, so it's been it's been about 7 years. Think of all the bikes and all the other startups that have been putting their bikes on the market. It's about that time when these batteries are going to recycling. And even back then, like, the solutions were not all there. The first American e-bike battery recycling program just started last year. So we're a little bit behind the US. In Europe, there's a little bit more progress, which is great. But you're absolutely right with the repurposing of batteries and the cells. There's a whole secondary market that's being created right now. I'm part of it as well, which is great. So we do have to think, especially with the latest challenges of supply chain with COVID and the war, and what, you know, who knows what's going to come next. But I think there's a lot of thinking about how can we you know, focus on what's around us from a European level. Think of all the batteries that are coming in by the millions. What can we do with them? So e-bike batteries, when they come to their end of life at about 80% capacity, but they can actually be reused for all sorts of other purposes, like mobile energy storage systems, which is a huge market. So I think there's going to be a lot more synergy with these different companies, and this is where circularity can happen and be really beneficial for companies in those spaces.
Right, and Patrick, the regulations about batteries are really technical, and I know I'm struggling to get my head around the new battery regulation, insofar as the company, the entity who has to recycle them is the one who put them on the market, right? What is that? If you sell it in a second use, okay, you're not putting it on the market, it's the second user. But what if you sell it, what if you fix it for someone else? And what if you're fixing it by buying it and then selling it back? What if you're fixing it through a consignment model where you're just fixing it as a service? And these are all really legal, technical points. They're not that interesting, but
well, Patrick, I mean, Siobhan mentioned the EU regulations. Could you kind of tell us what's happening? Maybe give us some context on that.
Yeah, first of all, these are exactly the questions that will keep us busy, and we will have to discuss it with authorities and regulators. But no, again, there is a battery directive already in Europe, which is also quite old. But of course, the legislator has seen that there are new developments. And for example, specifically on the electric battery in a car, that the batteries directive that we have is more for the battery as the starter battery, but not like a battery that drives the whole car. And so this is something new. And so there is a proposal for a new battery regulation on the table, and it will be likely adopted later this year. And that will introduce 2 more battery categories, including the one that specifically deals with batteries for electric vehicles. And there are a lot of things that we already discussed that will be introduced, starting, for example, everyone knows that a battery electric vehicle also has a carbon footprint, and it's not just the battery, it's also the production of the battery. So the legislator now also introduced rules on the production of the battery and the carbon footprint of that battery. So that's new. Then there will be rules on circular economy in terms of recycling in particular. So to what extent a certain material will still need to be recycled in the battery. So all the stuff that we are getting from the far regions and where you have all these issues. And then also you mentioned availability of battery. And so normally this is like sort of like you advertise your battery as being like long available, 80% for, I don't know, 6 years. And you could think it's an competitive advantage if you have a nice battery. But now the regulator says, I will give you some rules to what extent it has to be available. So even this, where you would think it's a business decision, the regulator says, no, we want them in the market as long as possible with the best availability as possible. So it goes to your point, it's not just the recycling, it's the full chain, it's basically circular economy. And so it will be very interesting to see when this comes into play, and is being enacted, how companies will deal with it, and then particularly also the questions that you raised about, you introduce it to the market again, like the second placing on the market, what does it mean? What responsibilities will the players have? So, I mean, a lot of nice areas to think about legally.
Well, and there's another one to think about, and governments just don't have rules that say you will do this at no matter the cost. Governments are increasingly offering incentives for the production of batteries, be either for climate purposes or for geopolitical purposes or industrial policy purposes. And in the US, a recent law is basically throwing $1 trillion on the table, maybe $2, for the production of clean energy materials, primarily batteries. So that makes the legal landscape much more complex. But as we start to think about the circular economy, to know what's happening, we need to track stuff and we need data. And Alix, I remember you telling me a story about actually weighing material yourself in your startup. So how do we start thinking about data and tracking things?
Yes, well, when you're a startup, you don't necessarily know about, especially when you're entering a new market, sometimes it takes a bit of time to understand all the regulations that you have to abide by. So when you place batteries and e-bikes on the market, you're responsible for declaring those batteries, paying the recycling fees, but also all the e-waste and packaging. So when you're a small team, you have to do a lot of stuff yourself. And the weights of all the light bulbs for Germany, the e-waste, and every country has their different regulations. So I was hand weighing all the different e-waste for all of our different parts, because those things are not necessarily on your bill of materials or your packing lists. So, and then you pay fees for all of these. So I was compiling all these lists with the weights and the materials and then the manufacturing processes. Of course, some companies have this better organized, but I was thinking like, wow, is everyone doing it like this? So it makes you think about the data flow and how important it is to have supplier relationships to make sure that that information you get it early on and it stays within all the documentation. Luckily, there's a lot of really good platforms out there and tools for ESG professionals to gather this data, because not every company has a sustainability manager or somebody who does ESG reporting. There are office managers who do it, people at all levels. So luckily, over the past year or two, there's countless new amazing platforms that help organize all these different reporting needs, which is great. So it facilitates reporting and hopefully makes sustainability a little bit more achievable. But yeah, I'm all about data now. I'm all about the supplier relationships and supply chain.
And that's so different from what I see. I have no idea how we get the data to report, because we have an entire department who does that. I don't even know who the people are, but I know that there are probably thousands of people involved in that, and you have maybe 20 people in your whole company. So chapeau, because that's huge.
Well, it is complex. I mean, any of you who are in a company know you have an accounting system, and then there are independent auditors. And when I speak with the auditing world, folks that think that we're going to have to follow the ESG metrics, track all that, report on it, have it reviewed and audited, that's a lot more difficult than following dollars or euros around. Maybe 3 times or 4 times more expensive. So that's another area of growth. As we close this panel, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing on the data and the transparency. What really fascinated me already, I think the first case that I had like more than 15 years ago about a non-compliance case in the automotive industry regarding certain material which was forbidden, environmental issue. The car manufacturer, they couldn't even tell the amount of the material that was in these parts and even where it was coming from. And so it was the lead issue, like the heavy metal lead issue. And we had a very similar issue 4 or 5 years ago, so 10 years later. And again, they had no clue where it was coming from and how much, and where they were even exceeding the limits. And I mean, that may have been an excuse like 10 years ago or 15 years ago and even 5 years ago, but now, with all the digital transformation, with the blockchain technology that you have, there are There are very innovative solutions around traceability along the supply chain, blockchain technology. This will no longer be an excuse. So you have to introduce these tools into your supply chain, these technology tools, so that you just can right away say, where is it coming from? And you can stop it immediately, and you have full transparency along the supply chain.
Yeah,
I've read that we have 20 to 30,000 parts in a car. So I know it's not an excuse, but that's a lot of parts.
Yeah, the excuses are going away just because, like in the U.S., every lime, if you were to go to a store, a vegetable has a tracking barcode on it, and they can take it back to which tree it was pulled off on which date. So the excuses are going away. Patrick, we've got a few seconds. I know that the European Court of Justice had a ruling, was it yesterday, and that it might have a broad application. Can you give us a touch on that?
Yeah, very briefly, it was a ruling about civil claims against car manufacturers because of illegal defeat devices. So you could think it's very specific, but the European Court, and this will have to be applied by all courts across the EU, basically said that these environmental rules are not only to protect the public as a whole, the general public, but also the individuals. And that may make it easier for individuals to make claims, to raise claims against companies for breaching environmental laws related to their products. It remains to be seen how this will be interpreted across all countries and also what the real implication of this judgment is. But you should just bear in mind, when you bring a product on the market, you better watch the environmental regulations, because with this judgment, it may become more difficult to defend.
All right. Well, Patrick, Alix, Siobhan, thank you very much. Thank you, audience. We're going to be talking about ESG for years to come. I think we'll probably continue it today. The Hogan Lovells booth is, I think, at D5. I'm going to go there and have a coffee. So if anybody wants to have a conversation, would love to see you soon. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, hands together for our panelists and our moderators as well. There we are, D5 for a chat, conversation, and a free coffee.